Hot breakfast? Yes. Well, listen, how many of you all have been to a large event like this in the last year and a half? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm super excited to be here. And not that I'm trying to break any rules, but I'm not going to wear the mask at least the time that I'm talking. So please, for those that don't like that, I ask for some forgiveness there. And for those that support me, thank you for that. So here we go. Good morning and welcome. I am extremely grateful we're here today after a year and a half of start, stop, pauses, redos, and do it again. I'm sure this resonates with all of you because we all had to make a lot of shifts, not only in our professional life, but also in our personal life. I want to thank everyone in this room, starting from our staff members. I know they're sitting somewhere around here. Hey guys, I want to say thank you to our students. Thank you. Yes. Thank you to our wonderful, wonderful, and amazing board that has provided amazing leadership and support, not only to me, to the organization, and to the staff as well, and to our great community partners that I'm seeing around here as well, and our great donors. So thank you, everyone who stuck with us in such a difficult time when there were a lot of other organizations that decided to take a different turn and shifted their priorities. So thank you, everybody that's here today.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Both unemployment and employment situation today are a little bit puzzling. Things feel like they've recovered really quite well. We no longer have 14 or 15% unemployment like we did 18 months ago. That being said, we know that there are still millions of people across the country not working today that work. If we just look at the total number of people that were working in February of 2020, there are millions of people less working. And that's because a lot of people have left the labor market. They're no longer counted in that statistic. Now, to say that it's all driven by the pandemic isn't necessarily correct. We knew that a lot of retirements were coming. Some of you all have heard me talk before, and you've heard about demographic changes that were coming. Well, a public health crisis that particularly affects older workers has led many of them to leave the labor market. But it's also meant we heard about caregiving for both young and old and family members that has led women, particularly with caregiving responsibilities, to have to leave the labor market. They're not working. The pandemic also, we all remember when you got dressed up like this to get on Zoom? We're a lot more used to using digital communication and digital skills now. We've all been talking about the future of work changing. That's sped things up a little bit too. We've adopted new ways of working. All of a sudden, our thought of going to the office 2 or 3 days a week feels like going back 60 or 70 hours a week. We're in a different world. We also knew that there were going to be fewer traditional students and workers. The children of the Great Recession, 2008, are coming of age. But in the Great Recession, a lot of people of parents' age decided not to have children. There's 15% less children coming of age in 2025 when those children of the Great Recession turn 18. So that means that our traditional students, the places that employers traditionally look for their core workforce, there's going to be less of them. Colleges are concerned about what it means for enrollments, and it's going to mean that there's a smaller workforce, which means something that we have to look to talent pools that we haven't looked at before. We have to look to women who have not been engaged or fully engaged in the workforce. We have to look to people of color who still, and women and people of color, deal with unemployment and disruptions from the pandemic in ways that the general population do not, still disproportionately affecting them. And it means that we have to integrate and pull in people that we have often overlooked. not just into the first jobs, but into gateway jobs that move people into targets and careers. Now that means that we have to also think about skills.
Yeah, well, I think Stuart used a really good way to describe what workforce looks like right now, and it's a puzzle. I think if you zoom back and look as a whole, and you think of the whole economy, and specifically you just look at the 10-county metro region, it mostly looks like the puzzle's complete, where we look like we're back to where we were 20 months ago. But the closer you start to look, you're missing a few edge pieces, you're missing a few of the trees in the landscape. You don't quite have what was on the box. And I think that's what's really fascinating, is as you dig down, you can see the more and more you start to look, the more you start to notice where things are different, both good and bad. Let's be sure to highlight the positive, because we really are seeing the growth in some of these industries that the pandemic has really highlighted. Your IT, your healthcare, your logistics. The only reason we're not back to full employment there is what Stuart was talking about, is we just don't have the workers. The labor force is smaller now than it was 20 months ago. And as we start to see people, whether it's childcare, whether it's hesitancy over the safety of the workforce, as those pieces start to fall into place, you'll see people start to come back into those. So those are the positives. On the other side of the spectrum, though, is really where we as a workforce system have really got to pay attention. Your hospitality and your service industries, retail, at least storefront retail, have really been decimated. And I'm not really optimistic, I think, that those are going to come back anytime soon. And why that's a challenge is that when we dig down into who that workforce is, it's exactly those individuals that are going to have the hardest time getting back. It's our older workforce. It is our women who typically have that childcare role in the home that have to get back into the workforce. In particular, our workforce of color that is having the challenges to get back into this. And as working in Fulton County, there's one extra layer to that too, the challenge of geography. When we talk about, again, these industries that have recovered, IT, healthcare, those are north of the city. There are not a lot of healthcare IT jobs south of I-20. There are not a lot of, if we have students that are looking to enter those fields, we don't have schools south of 20 for them to even get into those fields. And so that's one of the challenges that we have as workforce, and how workforce has changed is finding solutions to get our workforce transportation. MARTA doesn't extend down to Chattahoochee Hills, down into Union City, down into, it gets into East Point, but how do we get our workforce that are eager and willing to learn, how do we get them into that? So that's one of the challenges that we have of really getting there, but we're building partnerships. I am optimistic that we are finding solutions as we come together as a region to try to solve this problem. And so that's some of the workforce. Again, the digital literacy, I think we've talked about, comes into play. But I'll tell you one other area that I am, what's starting to keep me up at night is, you saw this week the president signed this bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's huge for the country. It's huge for the state of Georgia. Until you start to think about who's going to be responsible for building those bridges and building those roads and putting in the broadband so that we can have more access to digital skills and even our communities in the metro area that don't have reliable internet. And you've got to start having a workforce to do all of this. You've got to have basic literacy skills. You've got to have basic math skills for us to produce a workforce that is already a very tight labor market and already has a shortage of workers. And we've been talking for 10 years about older workers retiring and leaving the workforce, and it's nowhere more acute than it has been in skilled trades. And now we have to make up that gap in addition to what we're going to be facing in the next few years. So I think that's another challenge that we don't talk about that is going to be facing the industries for the metro region, but it's another opportunity for us to get in on the front end and make sure that we're equipped to help our students get there.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here today. I would be remiss if I didn't also thank Brian Green, who's our Southern Company. He just left Georgia Power to go to a new job, y'all. So he's at Southern Company Gas, but he's our member on the LAI board, so we appreciate that, Brian. Thank you. So when I was researching what to say today, I found a quote by I didn't find it. The person who helped me put this together, which is Lee, who's sitting at the table. I say I, it's like the royal I, or we is the royal we, so most of the time it actually means Lee, who helps me a whole lot. So Lee, raise your hand now that I've called you out. She's really embarrassed. But she found a quote, which I really love, that said, "Once you learn to read, you'll forever be free." And that's a quote by Frederick Douglass. And if you really think about the context of that quote, you know, the reality, the truth on its face is, yeah, once you learn to read, you have access to so much, and it makes your life so much better. But the reality is, if you think about the context, for Frederick Douglass to say that, it was in a time where it was illegal to teach African Americans or slaves to read, right? And so literacy has been used as a tool, or illiteracy, whichever way you think about it, in order to oppress people. So literacy is all about equity. If you go to even our modern days, of course, in many countries that have different views about women and their equality, in those countries, those women can't go to school, either because resources aren't provided to allow them to go to school to deal with issues, or they are prohibited or forbidden to go to school. And so when you think about, when we do at Southern Company, we think about literacy in that equity context. The company has done a lot over the years. Many of you know we always say, it's our tagline, we're a citizen wherever we serve. So we've always been involved and engaged in our communities, but we've not done that through the lens of equity. And what we decided to do, like many corporations in the wake of what happened in 2020, was to stop and take a look at what we were doing and ask ourselves, is what we're doing really impacting on this equity space? And so across Southern Company, we actually assembled 5 teams, 5 different work streams. There was talent, or is talent and culture. Those are 2 of them: community, political engagement, and supplier diversity. Of course, the first 2 are focused internally, the last 3 are focused externally. And we got together groups of employees to really talk about what we should do in these areas. And I was asked to lead what we call the community space of that. And that had to do with what we were going to do around our social justice giving. And I have a partner who is engaged on the community engagement or community investment pillar. And we work really, really closely together. And so we worked with a group of employees to come up with this goal of $225 million over the next 5 years to invest in 5 different areas to try to move the needle on social justice. Now, we certainly understand that we can't do that alone, right? That's our piece of what we feel like we can give, and Georgia Power's piece of that is $87 million. But what it really is about is we've always given away money. We've always been engaged in our communities. But again, if you apply an equity lens to that, how does that change what we give? Now, I tell people all the time, that doesn't mean we're not going to give to things that aren't social justice or equity related, because those things are important too. But when you look at what we're doing around giving, the larger percentage of what we're doing now is focused on social justice and equity. We've got 4 different focus areas in that area, and they all really relate back to literacy. And I'll be honest with you, until the research was done to think about this speech and what I was going to say today, I didn't completely understand that nexus between what we were talking about, what we wanted to do, and social justice and equity and literacy. And so I'm going to give you some more statistics. This is obviously a great time for stats. But of our 4 pillars, one of them is educational equity. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's like, how can we ensure that our educational system works in a way to both promote equity as well as have equity within that system? So when I stopped and did some research, of course, I found out that children of adults with low literacy skills are 72% more likely to be at a low reading level in school. That 2 out of every 10 kids that enter kindergarten with skills 2 or more grade levels below where they need to be, and you can add an additional child who is 1 grade level below. And for those kids, in a year, they can't make up 2 or 3. They might be able to make up 1, but they can't make up 2 or 3. Illiteracy is a major factor for when our adolescents graduate from high school, and ethnicity is a key factor in that. About 52% of Black fourth grade children and 45% of Hispanic fourth graders score below basic reading levels compared to 23% of white kids. So when you look at those in context and our work around educational equity, there's some really important work that's being done by Jamal Jesse, who's here today, as well as Joseph Lilybad, who run our education group in our Community and Economic Development Department, trying to identify school clusters across this state where we think we can move the needle, where we can see that they are historically disadvantaged communities with historically low scores, and we're asking ourselves, what would the investment take to move the needle? So we've identified 4 clusters across the state, and we'll be making investments into those clusters to see what impact can Georgia Power really have, and how can we be a model for other foundations and corporations that want to figure out how you move the needle on educational equity. Really proud of that work. So far this year, we've invested about $7 million in educational equity at Georgia Power alone. And that was at the end of the third quarter. So we know that at the end of this year, we'll actually exceed our targets for that. And we do have, I'll take a step back, specific targets that are reviewed, all of our moving to equity work, reviewed by our management council, that's our highest level of executives at Southern Company, and by the Southern Company Board of Directors and our individual board of directors. And we obviously have auditors involved to audit our results to make sure that what we say we've done actually is what we're doing. One of the other areas that we're focused on is criminal justice equity. And that one, of course, some 2/3 of students who lack proficient reading skills by the end of 4th grade end up in jail or on welfare. 85% of the youth that are involved in the juvenile court system are functionally illiterate, and 70% of those people in U.S. prisons don't read above a 4th grade level. We gave this year about $5 million so far at the end of the third quarter to help with criminal justice equity. Focused primarily on how we keep kids from entering the system. So that's everything from the At Promise Youth Centers here in Atlanta to giving money around expungement. So how do we help those folks that enter the system come out of the system and be able to work? And we've given lots of money to organizations that are really focused on that whole experience. So not just how do you do the expungement, but how do you work on literacy and workforce development skills so those people can enter the workforce. And at Southern Company, we have a no felon rule. It was really interesting when I started doing this work. The first thing I said was, I can't speak at any credibility about criminal justice equity as long as we at Southern Company say we're not going to hire felons. I wish I could say that we move fast. We don't. It has to go to the general counsel and the risk management group, but we're going through a process now. But there is a goal towards removing that particular prohibition, because what we understand is that felonies shouldn't be something that keep you from getting a good job. And there are lots of people out there that need the opportunity. And our third pillar is economic empowerment. And that's really focused on entrepreneurship and affordable housing and investing in small businesses. We know that people struggling with literacy are more likely to be poor, to lack education, and to miss out on opportunities to participate fully in society. And one thing that just struck me is that those with the lowest literacy scores are 16.5 times more likely to receive public financial aid in the past year relative to those in the highest literacy group. They're also more likely to have to be in that lowest measured wage group, working full time, but earning less than $300 per week. So this year, we've given about $5 million in an effort on economic empowerment, really focused on how we can help small businesses and entrepreneurs, how we can help people with affordable housing, and how we can help in neighborhoods like the west side of Atlanta through giving to the Grove Park Foundation. So our last area is energy equity, and when you think about energy equity, probably the closest literacy category to that is financial literacy. And quite honestly, the banks do such an awesome job in the financial literacy category that we've decided that that's not where we'll make our investment. Instead, we'll make our investment in how we make the products and services that we provide at Georgia Power, whether or not that's solar power or whether or not that's electric vehicle charging stations, available to all of the people who live in Atlanta, just not the more wealthy people who live in Atlanta. So we're working on that. So I'll close by, I was looking back up and there was a quote by Barack Obama, and this, actually I did find this one so I can take credit for this. It's not often, right, because Lee does such a good job. but it said that literacy is the currency for our knowledge economy. And we all really know that without the ability to be able to read and to be able to therefore then participate fully in our economy, it's really hard for you to be productive. Our economy and the health of our economy is directly tied to the literacy of our citizens. And so at Georgia Power and Southern Company, we really believe that whatever we can do to invest and make an impact, we're going to try to do. And it's really great, honestly, to work for a company that believes in that and to be able to do this work. But I know that many of you in this room work every day tirelessly to make that same impact, and we're just glad to be partners with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for having me today. First, I just want to acknowledge that I know we're running tight on time, so I'm going to push pretty fast and cut through some of the things that were already said. But the name of this event is actually Overcoming Obstacles to Economic Equity. And depending on how you define equity, and just so that everybody's clear where I stand, it is for those who need more, they get more, in order to make education an equalizing field for people to be able to transform their lives. Now, I'll just cut to the chase. I believe that you overcome obstacles to economic equity by stopping the, I think, very aggressive efforts to ensure that people make money off of poverty. There are so many efforts to actually capitalize on poor people that you end up with less resources to invest in them in the first place. And I will tell you, the one comment that was made today that touched me the most was by Pauline. I don't think, is she still here? God bless you. She said, I lost my dreams. And that was tied to her opportunity to have access to a quality education. And since it was already, used before, not this particular quote, but I just want to say, Bentina, I'm going to also reference a similar quote. But the idea that equal rights and equal means to maintain them was at the cornerstone of what Frederick Douglass was talking about in the late 1800s. Yes, it was tied to slavery, but it was also tied to education. And the behavior of the systems around what we've been doing in education as far back as his time hasn't been changed dramatically. You don't overcome an obstacle like this by not actually calling out the very systems that keep people trapped in intergenerational poverty. And part of my assignment today was to kind of look back at the previous speakers and unpack it a little bit so that we could have some trends or maybe walk away with some thoughts as we go back to our various places in life and leadership in Atlanta. And I see it in a couple of categories. There's the category of managerial leadership. Y'all were talking about it specifically from the perspective of the Federal Reserve Bank and the Fulton County workforce. But the idea that you're actually developing leaders and people in the pipeline for work that are getting access to the beyond the old systems of education, and not just job training, but career pathway access. And one example is rethinking what we're offering to adults in particular who are there to stabilize their family. I think the managerial or leadership component of this has been spoken to multiple times by this panel. And if the very leaders in this room who are responsible for creating these positions or creating bridges for people to have access to these positions, it becomes imperative that the managers, the leaders of these institutions actually change the way they are reaching down to help people who don't have those skills. Another category that I think everything kind of started falling into was the concept of educational or academic leadership in the field, meaning you can't just keep offering the same things. You have to actually change the curriculum. If you're in higher ed or if you're working in that space, That is one of the most important pieces to the work that we've talked about today, making sure that, yes, someone graduates from high school on time or gets that GED or whatever it takes for them to make it out of the space, but moving from a job mindset to a career mindset gets people more motivated to stay in the workforce. What I hear from even younger people as we're transitioning out of COVID is that, they don't want to work in something that doesn't inspire them. They're actually looking for a purpose because life seems more fragile today. And so if we're not thinking about the upcoming worker as well as maintaining some or creating some of the new structures or breaking down a lot of the challenges in there, whether it's racism or investing in some of the designs that works against poor people. I know someone used a statistic about prison, I think it was you, Bentina, about the age of kids. I mean, the thing that just makes it so hard for me to understand, I'm from the Deep South, I'm from Selma, Alabama, so we're all talking to the same people here. So I'm not judging, we're all family. But we spend more investing in prisons and building prisons from a private perspective than we do actually thinking about what we could be doing for children and their families so they get above that fourth grade reading level. And that's just another example of how we just, from a literacy perspective, just really hog-tie our families from being able to make these transitions. I'm also going to throw in political mindset. There are a lot of people on this stage that I have seen fighting, especially John, thank you for your comments, but, changing the designs of the system, working to take effective action to change the outcome, which is different to just doing something. Like you're challenging the status quo. You're telling people that enough is enough. And that part of the political leadership that people in this room could exercise would be mobilizing for people who don't have a voice or access to the roles and the opportunities that you have. And I think it's social emotional in its foundation. I always would tell teachers, if you don't like children, don't teach. I mean, this is like, you would think this is a basic concept, but that's not what people do. But it's also something like you have to take into your heart. You actually have to care about the experience of other people. And that's what led me to, once you get beyond like the basic, paradigm for kind of analyzing what people have said, are you willing to get the leaders and people in the pipeline to manage better with this future mindset? Are you willing to put in the academic and educational systems that address the needs of the very people we're trying to help? Are you also willing to take the political action to, challenge the status quo, even if it makes people uncomfortable or puts you in the hot seat? And finally, having the social emotional intelligence to care enough about them so that you treat them the way you treat your own family or you hope for your own children and young people in your life. Now that leads me to the next question around why I care about literacy action, why I have a massive crush on Addison Merriweather, who is really the cheerleader, the guy cheerleader. And as you know from high school, there are very few of them, right? So, but he was like that cheerleader who was getting into our Leadership Atlanta class. Many of them are here today at the back table. Wave your hands, clap. I'm glad that you're here because he was the one that kept explaining and sharing. But I also think, maybe he won't say it because he's really a sweet, nice person, but I'll say it. I don't think people care enough about this particular issue and the question around what can federal, state, and local agencies do. Fund it. Fund it. Fund the work that that Dr. Good is doing as well. I mean, you actually have to put the resources in the caregiver as well. And I'll close out, like as I was transitioning out of the superintendency, I teamed up with a great group of people, and we did a very deep analysis, and Brett, I should send it to you, about what's actually happening in the south side of the city. Everybody knows that's where the lack of opportunity is, it's a lack of investment, and so on and so forth. But what we did find was that whether it was self-reported or people calling into the 311 system for the metro area, or if they were reporting information to their principals and other leaders in their lives, they, of course, were concerned about just making ends meet, covering utilities and rent and things of that sort. But as we started going down the list, adult literacy was one of them. And it is because parents really do want to be involved in their child's life, but also have the skills necessary to be able to communicate with them today. And it is very hard to do that if your literacy skills are low, if you can't do basic math, and it's hard for you to communicate. And so what the data was showing, and thank you anybody who's with the Boston Consulting Group in this room, and they volunteered a ton of their time to analyze this with us, is that the stabilization of the caregiver, making sure that they are earning more than that $15,000 a year, getting them not into a livable wage, right? That is a goal, but you have to be in a wage that allows you to stabilize your family and then make the investments in things that the rest of us do in this room to be able to be involved as a relevant, resident and citizen in your community. So that is beyond the livable wage. And it doesn't take much, but once you stabilize the caregiver, the multiplier effect to everyone in that household is like eightfold. And so the reason I keep coming back, the reason I help raise money to support the program and direct other funders and people who care but might not have done anything given where we were in COVID and the general move today to invest in younger children and youth, we drove people back to this kind of program because the caregiver, if you want to eliminate an achievement gap in schools, right, making sure they don't come to us 2 and 3 years grade levels below where, into the kindergarten programs, it means that you have to invest in that family. It's the caregiver, the multiplier effect in that family when you help them with the education and they get the stabilizing economic power of at least a livable wage, but a little better and connected to a career, not just any job, because that's what Pauline talked about, right? You're like, I don't want to clean floors and bathrooms for the rest of my life. I actually want more. I want that dream. And if you live in America and if you believe in the amazing people and leaders like Frederick Douglass back in the 1800s, it is time for us to really give people freedom of life, opportunity, education, and ultimately, I'll close by saying, I think there should be another right added to this list, and it's the right to connectivity. It is as important as water was in the 1970s. It's as important as people not having to live in slavery in the 1880s. It is a right for every person on this planet because the digital divide is going to be the rate of change in technology is going to be the thing that separates the haves and the have-nots in the future. So getting our arms around that and ensuring that not just the adults, but the children have access to that is what will change our world. Thank you so much.